Hi, welcome back. This is the first real installment of my series chronicling my adventures with Proust. So today we're going to be covering about the first 150 pages or so of the first volume, Swann's Way. Before we get into that, just a couple of things to note, I guess. First of all, I'm experimenting with the mode of delivery for the series, so in terms of setup, I am no recording professional. I make no claims to the quality of these videos. I'm trying out something new today. We'll see if it works or not. Hopefully video and audio will kind of sort itself out, but I will experiment as I go along and maybe try out some new equipment as I get further into the series. Anyway, welcome back. If you're following along, we have made it to page 152 in the Moncrief translation of Swann's Way. And so what I'm going to spend today doing, this is sort of a trial run for how I want to structure these videos moving forward. I think I'm going to start off with sort of an overview of what's happened so far, and dig a little deeper into the themes that we see introduced here. I am realizing now, as we're really starting to get into the novel itself, how much there is to talk about, how much time I could spend on each page, honestly. Last episode, I talked a little bit about how Proust distills the insights of the novel onto every single page of it, and so I think it's going to be somewhat difficult to try and condense all of those really complex ideas into each of these videos where I'm going to be covering, 150 pages or whatever. But I'm going to try, and I'm going to try and get through it comprehensively and also relatively quickly. Okay, so we start off with the narrator recounting his experiences with sleeplessness. For a long time, I would go to bed early. This is the very famous opening line of the novel. And in these first pages, we have a very brilliant evocation of this disorientation of sleep and waking, where the narrator is kind of coming to terms with the boundaries of his own reality, and we see this blurring of the lines between reality and fantasy that's going to keep coming up, obviously throughout the first 150 pages or whatever, and my guess is that we'll continue to see this throughout the entire rest of the novel. So the narrator, we find, has trouble distinguishing between his immediate reality and the dreams or the fantasies or the books that make up a large part of his life. I think this is a very important theme to keep in mind as we continue reading, is this questioning of what is real and what's not. Also, the sort of flexibility of time, the ways in which time is malleable, how we can return to things continually in our memory. On the first page, the narrator is drifting in and out of sleep and imagining that he is the subject of a book he's been reading. And so this uncertainty about his own identity, about the reality of the waking world, is something that's really important, something that the narrator kind of continually struggles to clearly define, is where is that boundary between the waking world and dreams. We also, very early on here, we get an indication of the submerged memories that are going to keep coming up as the narrator returns to his own past. On page 3, he recalls this old terror of his great uncle pulling his hair. He says, quote, "While sleeping, I had drifted back to an earlier stage in my life, now forever outgrown, and had come under the thrall of one of my childish terrors, such as that old terror of my great uncle's pulling my curls, which was effectually dispelled on the day, the dawn of a new era to me, when they were finally cropped from my head. I had forgotten that event during my sleep, but I remembered it again immediately I had succeeded in waking myself up to escape my great uncle's fingers, and as a measure of precaution I would bury the whole of my head in the pillow before returning to the world of dreams." So we see here how the narrator's past is continually coming back to haunt his own present, and how there is this constant return to these really formative memories that are lurking somewhere deep in his subconscious and are constantly being evoked by his interaction with everyday things. We also, very early on here, we get this first glimpse of sexuality. This is on about page 4. He's recounting this dream he has about a woman. And so we get this first sense of longing and yearning that's going to show up again. Another one of the initial themes that's introduced is this sort of loss of self or loss of identity. The narrator is talking about how when he's sleeping, he sort of loses the sense of what is the boundaries of his own existence. He becomes a part of the greater universe. There's this really fantastic image of falling asleep in an armchair and being transported through this magical journey that's going to carry the sleeper at full speed through time and space. And when he opens his eyes again, he will imagine that he went to sleep months earlier in another place. We're running into this distortion of time again. The uncertainty between past, present, and future, and the sense that time is not necessarily linear. Another really interesting thing we see here is this contrast between the memories of the body and the memories of the mind, or the impressions of the mind. The narrator has this really visceral experience of waking up and not knowing where he is. This is something that all of us have experienced at one point or another, being unable to come to terms with where you are, what's going on around you. And his first waking impressions are those that are transported to him through his physical sensations, through his body. Even though his mind is sort of lagging behind, he's unable to process this situation intellectually, his body is slowly waking up and coming to terms with where he is. And so this orientation towards the physical world is coming from this kind of visceral awareness of it. It's not coming through detached contemplation. It's not coming from the mind. It's coming from this very tactile interaction with the world. And as the narrator is drifting in and out of sleep, he experiences this return to his childhood and his earlier years. He imagines that he is in his bedroom at Combray, which is the village where he would visit as a child. It's where his grandparents as well as his aunt live. And so it's this very, very deep formative childhood experience for him. And then he also fast forwards a little bit to years later. We get these memories that are not going to be particularly relevant to what we're reading at this early point in the novel, but we do get some initial foreshadowing at what's going to happen later on in his life. he also recalls this kind of terror that he would habitually feel, and at times I think still feels upon trying to go to bed. This fear of losing consciousness, this fear of the darkness and the loneliness that's going to overtake him when he goes to sleep. And in this insomnia, he finds himself retreating to memory as a kind of escape for the terrors of sleep. And the memory that he keeps going back to is this bedroom at Combray, because it's this site of intense anxiety and fear of sleep, but he also has these very warm memories attached to his time there and these family vacations that he would take. One really compelling image from this past is he remembers this lantern that he would have in his bedroom there that his mother would bring, and it would cast this image of a fantasy, this old tale of Golo and Genevieve. It's not really necessarily important to know the context behind that story. I think the important thing to take away here is how the narrator becomes really enveloped in this fantasy, in the images that he sees playing across the walls, and this uncertainty he feels again towards the nature of reality, as well as this fear of strangeness, because he does find himself in some ways discomfited by these images that he sees playing across his walls. The other really important thing that gets introduced here is this intense attachment to his mother, which we'll see again and again in this opening section. We also early on here get introduced to the narrator's grandmother. She is an outdoorsy woman who tends to shun some of the social conventions of the rest of her family. She is a favorite of her grandson, the narrator, but she doesn't always fit in with the rest of the family. We find out that the narrator, as a child, was very sickly and inclined deeply towards reading. He spends most of his time indoors. And this is also where we get some of our first glimpses at the broader family dynamics happening within the narrator's family. So we have the grandmother, Bathilde. She is worried for her grandson. We also get introduced to the narrator's great aunt, who is kind of a jokester. There's this one particular scene where the great aunt is enticing the narrator's grandfather to drink, which the grandmother has forbidden him to do. And this is like her way of teasing the grandmother. Later on, the narrator realizes that this is in jest, although, you know, it's a pretty bad joke. But the narrator in the moment is really hypersensitive to any kind of strife or conflict within the family. And so it really upsets him to see his grandmother put in that situation. Now we're getting here to one of the most famous images or parts of the entire novel, which is the mother's kiss. The narrator spends a long time relating his simultaneous ecstasy at the anticipation of the goodnight kiss, as well as this persistent dread he feels towards the moment when he knows it's going to end. Every night when he goes to bed. His mother comes to wish him good night, and she gives him a goodnight kiss. And in the moments leading up to it, he is filled with great hope. But as it's actually happening, all he can think about is that this has to end, and he's going to be left alone again. This is also where we are introduced to the titular Swann of Swann's Way, Monsieur Swann, who is a frequent guest at the house in Combray, and who we find out is in an unfortunate marriage. That's how it's described here. Swann's father was formerly friends with the narrator's grandfather, and he was a very eccentric character who's prone to these really intense mood swings. And so this is where those ties kind of originate. So Swann is caught in this really interesting class dynamic, and this is sort of the first treatment of class relationships that we get in the novel. So the narrator and his family are moving in these upper middle class circle, the haute bourgeoisie, if you want to get French with it. And so they're well-to-do, they are wealthy, however, they are not members of the aristocratic class. Even though we are past the French revolutions, there is still this lingering idea of aristocracy in the country. And so if you're not blood related to the members of that upper class, then you're not considered to be aristocratic, no matter how much money you might have, right? I think as American readers, it can be kind of hard to fathom that kind of system where it's not only money that matters, but also family ties. And so there's a lot of nuance here. And one of the things about Swann that's really interesting is that he is simultaneously moving in these upper middle class circles, like the narrator's family, but he is also secretly or not so secretly moving in aristocratic circles as well. We find out that he's a member of the Jockey Club, which is a very high class private club for the elite of Paris, not to be confused with the English Jockey Club, which is a similar organization. But in any case, it's a very prestigious organization. The middle class and the narrator's relatives, especially his aunts, see French society as a very firm caste system, in the sense that there's no chance for upward mobility, and everyone should only be mingling with and interacting with people of their own class status. They don't have a lot of patience for anyone who either descends below their own social rank or who's trying to rise too far ahead of it. And so this is why Swann seems to be a little cagey about his relationships in society, because he knows that it would be considered kind of unconventional. Swann is an enthusiast for art and antiques, but he's also kind of cagey about it. He inherited about 4 or 5 million francs from his mother, which I was trying to do the conversions on to figure out how much that would be in today's money. It was kind of inconclusive, so I'm not going to try and estimate for fear that I would be terribly wrong, but it's a lot of money. As the narrator is considering Swann and his flexible social position, he has this really interesting insight that all of us are socially composed creatures, right? There's not necessarily like an individual essence that lives organically in each of us. We're defined by our relationships to other people and how they perceive us. On page 23, the narrator says, quote, "But then, even in the most insignificant details of our daily lives, none of us can be said to constitute a material whole which is identical for everyone, and need only be turned up like a page in an account book or the record of a will. Our social personality is a creation of the thoughts of other people." And so I think this is a good thing to keep in mind as we're meeting all of these characters who are so often defined by their relations to others, and by their status within a very complicated social hierarchy. It's the sense that we are constituted as social creatures. This is reinforced upon this brief anecdote of the grandmother's visit to Madame Villeparisis. Side note, I have a little bit of French, not that much, and so pronunciation and things, I make no guarantees as to accuracy. I suppose I could use an audiobook or something for reference, but I'm just going to do my best for now. In this interaction, though, we see showcased these very contradictory class dynamics, because the narrator's family finds out that Madame Villeparisis, who is a woman from an aristocratic background, has some family associations with Swann, and because of these ties to someone who is clearly below her own class position, they, rather than raising their regard for Swann, this only makes them lose some regard for Madame Villeparisis' family, because they shouldn't be mixing with someone who is considered to be lesser than them. Another mark against Swann is that he marries someone whom they consider to be almost a prostitute, which is a direct quote. We don't get a lot of background at this point, but it's made very clear that this marriage is widely disapproved of, and from it, the others kind of mistakenly deduce his status in society. Now, the narrator's great aunt, who is certainly much more conventional than his grandmother, has very, very rigid ideas about class. And so she disdains anyone who stoops below or rises above their given social station. And in contrast to her, we are given to understand that the grandmother is the one who is rather unconventional in her social ways. Also, just to clarify quickly, there are a number of great aunts who are figuring in the novel. This particular great aunt is not the same as the grandmother's sisters, who are Flora and Celine. This great aunt is the grandfather's sister. As we continue learning about Swann, we see that we are told that he has a daughter who seems to be the reason for this unfortunate marriage. The narrator's mother tries to ask about this when he visits, but she's interrupted, and so she's not really able to get a clear answer. We're returning again at this point to the narrator's obsession with the Goodnight Kiss. Obviously, this is setting up a very nice Freudian dynamic for anyone who is into that sort of thing. he has this great anxiety anytime that there's visitors at the house in Combray, because he knows that his mother is going to stay in the garden with them rather than come up to give him her goodnight kiss. And so during the initial stage of this party, when the narrator is with them in the garden, he is making note of the characters' personalities, which are all very distinct. The grandmother sisters, Celine and Flora, in an effort to be tactful, make these really hilarious social faux pas, where they're trying to compliment Swann for a bottle of wine that he's brought, as well as an appearance of a piece of art that has appeared in the paper, but they're totally unclear. They're completely elliptical in their references. And then the narrator's grandfather, who's trying to have a serious intellectual discussion with Swann, is kind of foiled by all of these superfluous comments. So we get the sense of some of the narrator's disdain for these social niceties. One interesting point that Swann makes during this discussion is his point about modern journalism, when he's asked about reading the papers. He says, quote, "The fault I find with our journalism is that it forces us to take an interest in some fresh triviality or other every day, whereas only 3 or 4 books in a lifetime give us anything that is of real importance." And so he's criticizing the newspapers for the kind of gossip that they indulge in, while saying that true literary merit is only to be found in a select few number of works. And this is, I think, a very important thing to note while reading In Search, because for many of us who might not think that we have the time for such an undertaking, it's easy to think, why waste our time with this huge novel when we could be reading others? But then, according to Swann, really there is more wisdom in 3 or 4 books that you can keep reading over and over in your life, rather than trying to digest every single piece of writing that there is. On the other hand, though, this novel is also very interested in what Swann might be considering trivialities. It's very invested in the nuances of social relationships and gossip and all these sorts of things. So that's another contradiction that we get at this point. Shortly after this scene, the narrator is sent to bed without his treasured goodnight kiss. Horror of horrors. It is a dreadful fate. And so he has to sort of trudge up to his bedroom. Along the way, we get these really strong sensory details that are provoking a strong response associated with memory. In this case, it's the staircase that he's climbing. And so dejected, he goes to bed, but he formulates this scheme where he has his aunt's cook bring a letter from him to his mother saying that he needs to see her about something important, and when in fact he's just asking for the goodnight kiss. She doesn't respond, and so he is sent into a totally despondent state. And so he comes up with this desperate plan to stay up to see his mother and get that treasured goodnight kiss, even though he knows he'll be punished for it. He notes that he's often prone to giving in to his own anxieties rather than trying to ride them out. He's very neurotic. So as he's sleepless in his room, he is overhearing the conversation taking place in the garden. At this point, he also finds out that Swann's wife, the one who is considered to be almost a prostitute, actually lives with another man, and it becomes apparent that Swann does not actually love her. After this, the narrator's mother finally comes up And so he goes out to see her. He's deeply afraid of his father seeing him because his father seems to be far less sympathetic. However, when his father does arrive and see that he's been waiting, we get another very contradictory interaction. Because the father, even though he is less able to understand the narrator's condition, is actually more willing to give in to his demands. He thinks that it's okay to placate his sensitivities, whereas the narrator's mother and grandmother are much more firm with him because they know it's for his own good. He has to learn to develop this kind of self-sufficiency and independence. And so when the father comes in, he gives in to the narrator, and he says to the mother, go and comfort him. At the bottom of page 50, the narrator says, and thus for the first time my unhappiness was regarded no longer as a punishable offense, but as an involuntary ailment which had been officially recognized, a nervous condition for which I was in no way responsible. I had the consolation of no longer having to mingle apprehensive scruples with the bitterness of my tears. I could weep henceforth without sin. And so he no longer feels beholden to guilt about these really intense feelings that he has. But at the same time, there is a kind of regret that he feels, and this sinking sense that by winning over his parents and getting them to concede, he's somehow defeated them and proven them to be impotent in their parenting roles. And so this makes him even more unhappy. It's very clear that the narrator, right, he needs some kind of serious therapy for his emotional issues. But anyway, his mom comes in to read him some books, including some new ones that his grandmother has gotten for him. His grandmother at first brings back books that are far too advanced for a young boy to be reading. And so the father admonishes her and she brings them back. But then she returns with some volumes by George Sand, who's a famous French writer, because she refuses to get him anything that is not well written. And so this is where we see this kind of affinity between the grandmother and her grandson continue to develop. The grandmother is very, very interested in aesthetics and the importance of art. She has this preference for imagination over utility. She gives people chairs that literally fall apart because she appreciates antiquity and she dislikes earthly things. To her, something that is useful isn't in any way raising up the spirit or the soul. And so she wants to introduce the narrator to like famous works of architecture, but she prefers to get him paintings of those works because they've been filtered through like 2 layers of artistic interpretation. And so to her, they're less vulgar because they're less realistic. To her, art is like the only true thing that you should strive for. This is a key psychological focus in Proust, is that we are in a terrain of the mind, not of reality, so to speak. Now, there's a bit of a metaphysical detour coming up after this scene where the narrator is again contemplating the differences between sense memory and intellectual memory. On page 59, he offers a really interesting perspective, saying, I feel that there is much to be said for the Celtic belief that the souls of those whom we have lost are held captive in some inferior being, in an animal, in a plant, in some inanimate object, and thus effectively lost to us until the day, which to many never comes, when we happen to pass by the tree or to obtain possession of the object which forms their prison. Then they start and tremble. They call us by their name, and as soon as we have recognized them, the spell is broken. Delivered by us, they have overcome death and return to share our life. And so it is with our past. It is a labor in vain to attempt to recapture it. All the efforts of our intellect must prove futile. And so rather than trying to take this objective, intellectual approach to memory, Proust is using all of these sense impressions to transport us back to this childhood, back to these formative memories. Because there's no way that we can arrive at that past through some kind of scientific method, and art is the only way in which we can recapture it. This leads nicely into the next section where the narrator is eating petite madeleine 10 years after these memories have taken place. And this act of eating provokes in him this ecstatic reaction that seems unconnected with the pure physical act itself. It's this all-consuming, all-powerful joy. And at first he's not really sure what to make of it because of the difficulty of the mind trying to know itself. And so rather than trying to intellectualize it, he comes to the conclusion that we must create our own knowledge or our own understanding of what might be called the unconscious. He remembers then that the madeleine and the tea that he's dipping it into is strongly associated with ones that his aunt Leonie gave him in Combray long ago. And this memory broadens the theatrical set of Combray to include the town itself. And from here, we sort of expand outwards to the broader world that the narrator inhabits in this childhood. And this is where we get to part 2 of Combray, which is the initial section of Swann's Way. The first 60 or so pages are usually referred to as the overture, where the narrator is kind of setting up these themes and abstract ideas that are going to inform the rest of the novel. So now we get a little bit more anchored in these specific memories that he has. He describes Combray at length. It's an old medieval town that's enclosed by this huge circular wall. He also says that it's a bit depressing and forbidding. It is based on a real-life town that Proust went to in his childhood called Illiers. Now, the town has actually been renamed Illiers-Combray to reflect the importance of Proust's fictionalization of it. This is a town that's about 100 kilometers or so southwest of Paris. So the house in Combray is where the narrator's aunt lives, who inherited the house from her mother, who is actually the narrator's grandfather's cousin. So Leonie, the aunt, is not like a direct aunt, but you get the idea. She is an invalid. Her husband has died some time ago, and she's also an extremely emotionally unbalanced person. She is a kind of a strange recluse who speaks in low monologues to herself about minute sensations. She maintains this act that she never sleeps as other people do, even though it's clear that she does, but she forces everyone to kind of go along with it. She takes tea from lime tree sprigs and dips her madeleines in there, and that's what provoked the memory for the narrator. We get more here about the aunt's cook, who is a very distinct personality as well, Françoise. She loves the family of the narrator. They also find out that she has a strained relationship with her son-in-law, but that she confides deeply in her daughter, Marguerite. She is one of Aunt Leonie's only connections with the outside world. Aunt Leonie basically lies in bed all day and looks out her window to see what's happening in town. She's obsessed with knowing everyone who passes outside her window because this is a small town. Everyone knows each other and what's going on at all times. And so strangers are totally unheard of. Anyone that the aunt doesn't recognize, she makes someone find out who they are, who they're connected to, so that she can have a complete picture of the social web of the town. Another description we get here is of the local church, Saint Hilaire, I think, and the artwork that's in it. It's a place of great antiquity. It's unassuming, but it's very distinct from the rest of the town, and it has this enormous steeple that can be seen from miles away, which is the great feature of the town. Given the age of the church, the narrator sees it as extending through time in a kind of fourth dimensional way, which is really interesting and I think really parallels the way that the narrator is able to move fluidly between past and present. There's a lot of characters that we're introduced to in this section, locals. One of them is Eulalie, one of the only friends of Aunt Leonie. Eulalie is an old spinster and a former servant who balances an affirmation of Aunt Leonie's hypochondria with a persistent optimism that she's going to get better. Aunt Leonie is a very difficult character because she demands that everyone not only tell her that her affliction is very real and sympathize with her, but also be sure to tell her that she's going to recover at any moment. We also get a memory of Uncle Adolphe, who was a former army major who no longer visits Combray because of an incident with the narrator, which is related at length here. Earlier on in his childhood, the narrator had what he calls a platonic love for the theater, which he never actually went to. He just sort of liked to think about it in the abstract. He imagines that it's a place where everyone is looking into these little viewing glasses and seeing a completely different drama taking place from everyone else. Sort of amusing to consider that, like, in the age of smartphones and everything. But one day, the narrator goes to his uncle's house to try and pursue one of the actors that the uncle is friends with. And he finds his uncle in a very compromising situation with what we might reasonably call a woman of ill repute. It's not exactly clear if she is a prostitute. It seems to me that that's pretty likely. But in any case, it's a very embarrassing situation for the uncle. The narrator tells his family about the encounter, and then there's a fallout that happens, and so he doesn't see his uncle after that. Aside from the theater, one of the narrator's early passions is reading, and he really deeply inhabits books more than he inhabits the real world. His family tells him, to get outside and like stop holing up in your room all the time, and so he will sit outside and just read his books, and it doesn't really matter where he is so long as he's engrossed in that world. There's a really important section here which I think crystallizes the importance of fiction. This is about on page 116 and 117, where basically the narrator is describing how much closer fiction brings us to sympathizing with other people and even inhabiting their situation in a unique way that is impossible to achieve in real life, because there's a kind of immersion in that person's subjectivity that comes through in fiction. And so I think that's a good thing to keep in mind as we keep on encountering all these new characters, as we keep on getting deeper into the narrator's mind, of just the depth of psychological insight that Proust sees fiction as offering. Another thing that the narrator notes in his reading is that time is constantly distorting, which I think is, he's unable to tell the flow of time when he's engrossed in his books, which I think parallels the way that time distorts throughout this novel as well. One of the authors that he becomes fixated on very early on is an author named Bergotte. This is recommended to him by his childhood friend Bloch, who is kind of a young, snobbish child. He has rather eccentric ideas and behavior. He's actually banned from visiting the family after telling the narrator that his great aunt was a, quote, kept woman. He's very kind of blunt and uncompromising in his positions. From Bloch's recommendation, the narrator dives into the work of this writer, Bergotte. He is very drawn to the depth and the vividness of Bergotte's images. He finds those impressions more important than the narrative itself. He doesn't really care about the plot so much, but he loves the long digressions that Bergotte will take. That's the highlight for him of reading, and that's something that also, I think, is very much in line with what Proust is doing in this novel. The narrator then finds out that Swann actually knows Bergotte personally and offers to have him write in the narrator's book. At this point, the narrator notes Swann's contradictory character. Sometimes he's very ironic, sometimes he's very sincere, and at this point he can tell that Swann moves in a remote social circle that the narrator at this point is just not quite equipped to understand. He also thinks about Swann's daughter, Mademoiselle Swann, who becomes an object of the narrator's love without him even having met her, just due to her proximity to Bergotte, right? If Swann's family knows this great writer that the narrator is so obsessed with, he is already kind of idealizing Swann's daughter. The section that we read for today ends with a visit from the curé, a kind of clerical figure who is visiting the narrator's aunt, Leonie. He's a very tedious man who's trying to get the church renovated, and he bores Aunt Leonie so much so that she has to send her good friend Eulalie away. And then there's this interesting reflection from the cook, Françoise, who has this envy for Leonie's gifts to Eulalie. Françoise regards Eulalie as a kind of rival because the aunt gives Eulalie charity, basically, just for hanging out with her. And to Françoise, it's okay for rich people to give each other gifts because that's just what they do. But for Leonie to be giving gifts to people of a lower class than herself is just kind of degrading. And if she's giving them to Eulalie, then why isn't she, showing a little bit more generosity toward Françoise, her cook? So that's another kind of interesting class dynamic that we see at this point. And the last thing that happens in this section is that one of the other maids, who is rotating throughout the household, is reaching childbirth, and so the cook Francoise has to leave to get a midwife, and that totally throws the household into disarray because she's like the one who keeps it organized and everything. So that's just sort of a broad stroke summary of everything that's happened so far in the novel. We get, I think, some really fantastic previews of all of the major themes that are going to keep coming up for us. And we're introduced to a lot of very memorable characters. I hope that kind of sets up some of the ideas that are informing the novel. Of course, this being my first time, I make no claims to the definitiveness of my judgments. They may be inadequate to describe everything that's going to happen from this point on out. But these are just sort of my initial impressions. I also have gotten a couple companions that are, I don't know, I think sort of helpful, but not necessarily indispensable. So if you're reading along, you might decide to use some of these things, you might not. One of them, I got this Marcel Proust Search for Lost Time by Patrick Alexander. It's just a reading guide. It's helpful, I think. It's offering broad summaries of the plot, and there's also a nice summary of the characters in each of them, and then there's also a little bit of historical context. So this is, from what I can tell so far, a nice thing to have, but not by any means absolutely necessary. I think if you're keeping up with this series, hopefully it will kind of reinforce the plot and the characters and the themes so that you wouldn't necessarily have to be using something like this. But I'm using it just to, make sure that I'm on the right track and everything. The other thing I picked up is this Paintings in Proust, which is a really nice visual companion because there are lots of paintings and artists that Proust is referring to. He's also a very visual writer. He's constantly describing things with a real depth of imagery and a kind of impressionism. And so this is a really nice companion to have. Again, not necessary, but I'm enjoying it a lot. Just because it helps kind of frame some of Proust's references and give you an idea of some of his artistic inspiration. I haven't brought any of this up yet. Maybe I will later, but those are just a couple of the things that I've been using to inform my reading process. So for next week, it's going to be a little bit of a shorter section to read, only about 110 pages or so. Again, in the Modern Library edition. We're going to read until the end of Combray, which is the first part of Swann's Way. And then the next section is Swann in Love. So we're going to stop there, and then that will be the beginning of the following week. I'm going to take a week off there because we're coming up onto Thanksgiving, and I'm going to be away for a while. So I will not be recording an episode that week. So you can take a little bit of a break between Combray and Swann in Love. And then we'll take a couple weeks, I think, to get through that section, and then another week to get through the final part of Swann's Way. That's what the schedule looks like coming up. So, happy reading. Thanks for tuning in. I hope this maybe helps you as you are working your way through the initial opening pages of Proust, One thing that I did sort of note from this companion is that this opening section is one of the most abstract parts of the novel. And so if you find yourself struggling through it a little bit, or overwhelmed by all the description and philosophical detours that Proust is taking, that's okay. Basically, what he's doing is setting up a lot of the ideas that are going to be coming back throughout the rest of the novel. So at this point, you might find yourself getting into it a little more. All right, thanks for tuning in. Happy reading. I hope you can find some lost time over the next week, and we'll be back to discuss the rest of Combray. Bye.